The morning Clara Whitcomb brought 700 unwanted guinea fowl onto her father's farm, the whole county road slowed down to watch. It was barely past sunrise, and the April fog still lay low over the ditches, silver and thin above the red Missouri clay. Clara's old pickup came rattling over the gravel with a livestock trailer behind it, one fender wired on with baling twine. From inside came a sound no one on Whitcomb Road could ignore. 700 birds screamed, fluttered, and beat their wings against the wire. By the time Clara backed the trailer beside the collapsed cattle shed, 3 trucks had stopped along the fence line. Mr. Harlan from the next farm leaned out his driver's window with coffee in one hand. The mail carrier rolled by twice without delivering a single letter. 2 boys from the feed store parked near the ditch and pretended to check a tire while staring straight at her. Clara climbed out without looking at any of them. She was 24, narrow-shouldered, sunburned across the nose, wearing her father's old denim jacket with the cuffs rolled twice. Beside the barn door, her blue heeler, June, lifted her head from the dust and gave one tired bark before dropping back down. June used to run the fences from sunup to sundown. Now she spent most mornings chewing at her own skin. Her ears were raw at the edges. Her collar was stained where Clara had dabbed medicine under it. The dog's eyes followed Clara everywhere, loyal and exhausted. Clara walked to the back of the trailer, lifted the latch, and stepped aside. The birds poured out like spilled storm clouds. Gray bodies with white speckles rushed across the yard. Some flew to the roof of the tractor shed. Some ran under the rusted hay rake. Some scattered into the Johnson grass by the fence. Their calls ripped through the quiet morning until even the cattle in the far pasture lifted their heads. Clara did not chase them. She did not shout. She did not explain. She opened a small black notebook, made a mark with a pencil, then walked to the barn and set down 3 dented feed pans in a straight line. By noon, the story had reached town. Clara Whitcomb, who was already 2 payments behind at the bank, had not bought seed. She had not repaired the baler. She had not hired anyone to patch the north fence. Instead, she had filled her dying family farm with 700 loud, unwanted birds that nobody else had been foolish enough to keep. That afternoon, she nailed a hand-painted sign to the main gate. "Do not spray. Birds working." A pickup rolled past slowly. Someone inside laughed loud enough for her to hear. Clara kept hammering. The farm behind her looked like it had been holding its breath for years. 96 acres of tired pasture, broken fence posts, leaning sheds, and fields that had given less hay every season since her father got sick. The red barn had a roof patched with mismatched tin. The water trough near the lot leaked into a muddy ring. The old International tractor sat where it had died the previous fall, one rear tire soft and sinking. Her father, Daniel Whitcomb, had been the kind of man people waved to first at the co-op. He could read a calf's limp from across a pasture and tell by the smell of a wind whether rain would hold or pass. But sickness had made his hands shake, medical bills had hollowed out the savings, and the drought 2 summers before had finished what bad prices started. By the time Clara buried him on the hill behind the farmhouse, the bank already had its hand on the place. She had come home from community college with 1 semester unfinished and a stack of agriculture books in the passenger seat. That was enough education for people to call her book smart, and not enough experience for anyone to call her a farmer. Too young, too stubborn, too late. There were only 23 cows left from her father's herd. The hayfield was thin. The creek bottom was choked with brush. Deer crossed the back pasture every night, leaving trails through the tall grass. The barn cats had disappeared one by one, and June scratched herself raw after every trip along the fence line. Clara had noticed the ticks before anyone else cared to count them. They were in the grass behind the chicken coop, on the ears of the calves, under June's collar, crawling on Clara's socks when she came in at night. Some days, she picked 30 or 40 off the dog before supper. Some days, the cows stood in the shade rubbing their shoulders against hedge posts until hair came off in patches. At night, June would limp into the kitchen and lay her head on Clara's boot while Clara worked the ticks loose with tweezers. The dog never snapped, she only trembled. Every time Clara dropped another swollen tick into a jar of alcohol, it landed with a tiny wet sound that made her stomach turn. But when Clara mentioned ticks at the feed store, the men near the coffee pot shrugged. Every farm had ticks. Every pasture had pests. You sprayed, you burned brush, you hoped for frost. That was how it was done. Clara did not have money for repeated spraying. She did not have money for a hired crew. She barely had enough diesel to cut hay if the tractor ever started again. What she had was a phone call from a hatchery 2 counties over that was shutting down, and a man who said he had hundreds of guinea fowl nobody wanted. Noisy birds, nervous birds, half-wild birds, birds that flew where they pleased and screamed at everything from snakes to plastic bags. Clara took all 700. The laughter started before the first week ended. At Miller's Feed and Seed, someone called them noise with feathers. At the diner, a retired cattleman said Daniel Whitcomb would have known better. At church, 2 women lowered their voices and wondered if grief had made Clara strange. Along the road, neighbors watched guinea fowl perch on Clara's porch rail, scatter across her driveway, and roost on the hay wagon like a spotted army with no commander. The banker came on a Thursday. His name was Alan Reeves, and he stepped carefully around bird droppings on the gravel as if the ground itself had become evidence against her. His clean truck looked out of place beside Clara's rusted equipment. He stood by the gate with his clipboard tucked under one arm, while a dozen guinea fowls circled his polished shoes. Clara came from the barn carrying a bucket of feed. Mr. Reeves looked at the birds, then at the sagging roof, then at the field beyond the house. "You understand noise is not income, Miss Whitcomb," he said. Clara set the bucket down. "Yes, sir. And the bank cannot refinance a feeling." "No, sir." A guinea fowl launched itself from the fence and landed on the hood of his truck. Mr. Reeves flinched. Clara did not. He looked at the bird, then back at her. "Your father had instincts," he said, "but instincts do not transfer on a deed." Clara swallowed once. Her hands stayed still at her sides. The county agent came the next week and gave gentler advice with the same meaning. "Clear the brush, reduce livestock stress, consider chemical treatment, focus on cash flow. Birds might help around a garden," he admitted, but Clara needed a serious plan. She nodded. She thanked him. She wrote down the date in her notebook after he left. She had learned from her father that people listened better to results than explanations. So Clara worked. She built mobile coops from pallet wood, bent cattle panels, scrap roofing, and wheels pulled off a dead lawnmower. She patched wire with feed sacks and zip ties. She set water stations along the brushy creek bank. Every evening, she trained the birds to return to feed by shaking corn in a coffee can and ringing an old brass bell her mother used to hang by the kitchen door. June followed her at first, limping through the yard, wanting to help. But the dog tired quickly. Clara would find her lying in the shade of the water tank, eyes half closed, one hind leg twitching, as if even sleep could not free her from the crawling itch. The first nights were chaos. Some birds slept in trees, some vanished into the hedgerow. Some landed on the roof and refused to come down. A fox broke into one of the coops and killed 27 before Clara heard the screaming and ran across the yard in the dark with a flashlight and a shovel. By dawn, she was kneeling in mud, repairing wire with bleeding fingers. A truck passed on the road. It slowed, then kept going. Clara did not look up. Inside the farmhouse, bills waited on the kitchen table. The bank notice sat under a salt shaker so the summer breeze would not lift it. A photograph of her father was stuck to the refrigerator with a seed corn magnet. In it, he stood beside the old barn, one hand on a gate, smiling like a man who believed land could still be saved if a person paid attention. One rainy night, Clara pulled down the cedar box from the pantry shelf. It held old farm papers, yellowed receipts, grazing maps, and notebooks tied with string. Some belonged to her father, some belonged to her grandfather, Earl Whitcomb, who had farmed before chemicals became the first answer to every small living thing that moved through grass. Clara sat at the kitchen table, while rain tapped the tin roof, and guinea fowl muttered from the dark shapes of the coops outside. June lay beside her chair, too tired to scratch. In one notebook, Clara found a hand-drawn map of the North Pasture from 1974. Her grandfather had marked deer trails, wet spots, brush lines, and places where cattle rubbed raw in late spring. Beside the creek, in his square pencil handwriting, he had written one sentence: "Guineas cleaned the North Pasture before we ever sprayed a gallon." Clara read it 3 times. Then she turned the page and found notes on rotating the birds behind cattle, feeding them only at dusk so they would forage during the day, keeping them near brush but moving them before they overworked one area. There were tick counts written in pencil, not scientific enough for a university, and too careful to ignore. Her father had added notes years later in blue ink. "Watch the dog, watch the calves' ears, watch where the wild turkeys scratch. Bugs tell on the land before the grass does." Clara looked down at June. The dog lifted her eyes, trusting and worn out. After that night, Clara's strange decision became a system. She divided the farm into rough zones: barn lot, orchard, south pasture, creek bank, north brush, calving field. She dragged a white flannel cloth through the grass every morning and counted the ticks that clung to it. She checked June's collar at noon and dusk. She inspected the cows' ears, tails, and bellies. She marked which coop moved where, how long the birds stayed, how much feed they received, and how many ticks she found afterward. The guinea fowl moved like restless weather. At sunrise, they spilled through dew-heavy grass, pecking beneath seed heads, around fence posts, under the low branches where deer slipped through at night. They hunted grasshoppers in the garden rows, beetles near the barn, ticks along the cow paths, and anything small enough to swallow. They screamed at snakes. They screamed at hawks. They screamed at Clara's pickup every time it backfired. They were difficult, stubborn, and loud enough to make a person question mercy. But slowly, the farm changed. The first real sign came from June. One evening in May, Clara reached for the tweezers out of habit. June climbed onto the porch, leaned against Clara's knee, and let Clara search her ears, neck, belly, and paws. Clara found 3 ticks. Only 3. She sat there with the tweezers in her hand, not moving. June looked up at her, then wagged her tail once against the porch boards. Clara pressed her forehead against the dogs. The cows spent less time rubbing against posts. The calves slept better in the shade. Around the barn, Clara could walk through grass without coming back, with ticks crawling up her socks. The North Pasture, once the worst place on the farm, began to feel safe enough for her to kneel in without checking her sleeves every few seconds. No one else saw a miracle. They saw Clara working herself thin. They saw birds on the roof, patched coops in the pasture, and a young woman who still owed the bank more money than she had. They saw her truck stall at the feed store. They saw her counting bugs in a jar and writing numbers in a notebook like numbers could hold back foreclosure. By early June, the county stopped laughing for a different reason. The winter before had been too warm. The spring had been wet and heavy. Grass grew fast. Brush thickened along creeks, and deer moved closer to barns than usual. Then the ticks came. They came in numbers older farmers said they had not seen in decades. They waited on grass tips in little dark knots, legs lifted, reaching for heat and breath. They crawled up pant legs before a person had crossed 10 yards. They gathered behind dogs' ears until the skin looked peppered with black seed. They swelled under collars, under tails, between hooves, in the folds of calves' necks. When crushed, they left blood streaks on porch boards, barn walls, shirt cuffs, and the inside of children's socks. At the diner, mothers checked their children's hair before letting them sit down. At the feed store, men stood in the parking lot slapping at their jeans, then looked down to find another speck climbing toward the knee. Dogs returned from pastures with their ears crusted and trembling. Cows stamped until dust rose around their legs. Horses rubbed their manes bloody against rails. Calves bawled at night, thin-voiced and restless, as if the dark itself had teeth. The vet's truck ran from farm to farm until dust coated the windshield so thick his wipers left brown arcs. At Miller's Feed and Seed, the shelves emptied of sprays, powders, collars, dust bags, and anything with a label promising relief. A shipment arrived on Monday and was gone before noon. Rain washed off treatments. Brush held more ticks. The creek bottoms became crawling banks of hunger. The county agent issued a notice. Worst tick pressure in recent memory. Clara read it at the kitchen table, while the bank's final summer deadline sat open beside her coffee. 30 days. That was what Mr. Reeves had given her. 30 days to show enough income or a credible plan, or the bank would move forward. There were buyers waiting. Everyone knew it. A developer wanted the front acreage near the widened county road. Mr. Harlan had once hinted that if Clara ever needed to sell the back pasture, he might take it off her hands. Now the whole county was spending money it did not have, fighting something smaller than a fingernail. And Clara's farm was full of birds. At first, nobody wanted to ask. Pride held them back longer than common sense. But the tick season kept getting worse. A neighbor's prize bull developed fever. 2 farms lost calves. Children were told to stay out of tall grass. Dogs were shaved down and still came back carrying ticks. Then one afternoon, Mr. Harlan's teenage grandson cut across the Whitcomb fence line looking for a missing dog. He crossed from Harlan pasture into Clara's north field, walked half a mile along her creek bank, found the dog near a fallen sycamore, and came out at her barn. Clara gave him water and checked the dog with him beside the trough. The boy looked down at his white socks. Almost nothing. He had walked through Clara's grass for half an hour and found only 2 ticks. On the other side of the fence, his grandfather's pasture was so thick with them that the boy had stopped wearing shorts weeks before. By evening, the story reached the diner. By morning, Mr. Harlan's truck was parked outside Clara's gate. He did not get out right away. Clara saw him through the kitchen window, sitting behind the wheel with both hands on the steering wheel, looking at the sign he had laughed at in April. June stood beside Clara's leg, alert now, no longer raw and shaking. Outside, the guinea fowl worked the ditch line in a noisy gray wave. Finally, Mr. Harlan stepped out. He had known Clara since she was small enough to ride on her father's feed sacks. He had also been the first man to laugh when the birds came pouring out of the trailer. Now he walked up the drive with his hat low and his pride dragging behind him like a chain. Clara met him by the gate. For a moment, neither of them spoke. A guinea fowl screamed from the fence post between them. Mr. Harlan cleared his throat. "Morning, Clara." "Morning, Mr. Harlan." He looked past her toward the pasture. "Birds look busy." "They usually are." Another silence stretched between them. "My grandson said he walked your creek pasture yesterday." "He did. Said he barely picked up a tick. That's what he told me." Mr. Harlan's jaw tightened. He looked toward his own land beyond the fence, where cattle stood bunched under the trees, switching their tails and rubbing against anything solid. "I've got calves getting eaten alive over there," he said. Clara did not answer. He turned back to her. "I suppose you heard that. I hear a lot from the road." The words were calm, but they landed hard. Mr. Harlan looked down at the gravel. "I said some things," he muttered. "Yes, sir. About your birds." "Yes, sir. About you." Clara held his gaze. June stepped forward and stood between them, quiet and steady. Mr. Harlan took off his hat and rubbed the sweat line on his forehead. "I was wrong," he said. Clara waited. It would have been easy to rescue him from the silence. Her father would have filled it with something kind. But her father had also taught her that a man who planted a thing ought to stand long enough to see what grew from it. Mr. Harlan swallowed. "I need your help." The guinea fowl moved through the grass behind Clara, pecking fast beneath the seed heads. "How many acres?" Clara asked. He blinked. "What?" "How many acres need birds?" "The creek pasture." "Maybe 12. Brush is worst along the south fence." "Any dogs loose?" "One. I can pen him." "Any recent spray?" 2 days ago." I won't put birds there for another week. Mr. Harlan looked up sharply. Clara, I don't have a week. Then you should have asked before you sprayed. His face reddened, not with anger exactly, but with the shock of being answered by the girl he had mistaken for helpless. He looked toward the birds again. What'll it cost? Clara opened her notebook. 4 coops, 10 days, rotation along the creek and south fence. You cover any birds lost to your dog, your equipment, or your negligence. Half paid before I move them. Half paid when the tick count drops. Mr. Harlan stared at her. That's a business price. Yes, sir. I'm your neighbor. You were my neighbor in April, too. The wind moved through the weeds by the ditch. Far off, one of his calves bawled, thin and irritated. Mr. Harlan looked at June, then at the healed patches along her neck where the hair had started growing back. He looked at Clara's sign. He looked at the old barn, the unpaid debt sitting invisible behind every board, and the young woman standing in front of him with mud on her boots and numbers in her book. At last he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out his checkbook. His hand hesitated before he wrote, "You drive a hard bargain, Clara Whitcomb." Clara did not smile. "No, sir," she said. "I learned what my work is worth." He signed the check. That afternoon, Clara moved 4 coops to Harlan's Creek pasture. He watched from his ATV as the guinea fowl swept through the grass in noisy, pecking waves. He said nothing when Clara rang the bell at dusk and the birds came running back to feed. He said nothing when she dragged the white cloth through his grass on day 1 and showed him the ticks clinging to it like scattered pepper. He said even less when she did it again on day 10 and the cloth came back nearly clean. By the end of the 2nd week, his grandson could walk the same stretch without coming back covered. Then another neighbor called. Then another. Clara began selling guinea eggs to people who wanted to hatch their own flocks. She sold young birds in groups of 25. She charged to bring her coops to farms with tick-heavy lots. She wrote simple rotation plans for people who had once said notebook ideas would not save land. The county agent returned in late July. This time, he brought sample bags, forms, and a quieter voice. He walked Clara's pastures, inspected the cattle, checked June's coat, and listened while Clara explained her rotation system. She showed him the tick counts in her notebook, before birds, after 3 days, after 7 days, after 2 weeks. She showed him maps copied from her grandfather's notebook and the updated version she had drawn herself. He stood beside the north pasture gate for a long time. The cows grazed calmly in the heat. Guinea fowl worked the shade beneath the hedge apples. June trotted ahead of them through grass that would have made her bleed 2 months earlier. The old barn creaked in the wind behind them. The agent finally looked at Clara the way people used to look at her father, like the land had spoken through her, and he had only just learned the language. In September, Mr. Reeves came back from the bank. The yard was still rough. The tractor still needed repair. The barn roof still wore patches of 5 different colors. Guinea fowl still screamed at his truck as if he were a fox in a tie. But the farm was not the same place he had visited in spring. There were receipts on Clara's kitchen table now. Egg sales, bird sales, pasture service payments, a contract with 3 neighboring farms for next season, a letter from the county agent recommending her tick control rotation as a local pilot program. Her cattle were healthier than they had been in 2 years, and she had kept every calf born that summer. Clara slid a payment envelope across the table. It was not enough to make the debt disappear. It was enough to stop the foreclosure process, enough to prove the farm had income, enough to buy time. Mr. Reeves opened the envelope, counted once, then stopped. His eyes moved over the receipts, the signed contracts, the county letter, and the old farm kitchen where Clara's father's photograph still watched from the refrigerator. Slowly, he removed his hat. "I misjudged the birds," he said. Clara stood across from him, hands folded. Then Mr. Reeves looked up. "And I misjudged the farmer." The room went quiet, except for the distant cries of the guinea fowl outside. After he left, Clara stood alone by the sink and watched his truck disappear down the gravel road. She did not cry then. She had cried too many nights already, quietly, with the bank notice open and her father's photograph watching from the refrigerator. Instead, she walked outside. The evening light stretched gold over the pasture. Hundreds of guinea fowl moved through the grass in scattered lines, their speckled backs flashing between the stems. June trotted beside Clara without stopping to scratch. In the distance, the cows grazed with their heads down, peaceful and steady. A truck slowed near the gate. Then another. People no longer came to laugh. They came with notebooks, questions, and embarrassed pauses. They asked how to train birds to return at dusk, how many acres a flock could cover, how to protect them from foxes, how to keep them from roosting on the porch, which grasses held the worst ticks, how often to rotate. Clara answered what she could. She never made them apologize. She did not need to. Their silence did that for them. Late that fall, after the first hard frost finally knocked the tick season down, Clara repainted the sign at the gate. The old words had faded under sun and rain, but she kept them exactly the same. Do not spray. Birds working. Below it, in smaller letters, she added, Whitcomb Farm Natural Pasture Service. Then winter came. For the first time in nearly a year, the farm grew quiet without feeling dead. Frost silvered the pasture every morning. The creek moved slow under a skin of ice. The guinea fowl stayed close to the barn, round and still on their roosts, their wild summer noise softened into low muttering beneath the rafters. June slept by the stove without scratching, her paws twitching in dreams that no longer seemed troubled. Clara spent those cold weeks repairing what she could, one small thing at a time. A gate hinge, a broken window latch, a section of roof over the feed room, nothing dramatic, nothing anyone driving past would notice. But every evening, when she turned off the barn light and looked back at the house glowing warm against the snow, she felt something she had not felt since before her father got sick. The farm was resting, and it was still hers. The next spring, the county extension office asked her to speak at a small workshop. Clara almost said no. She still hated standing in front of people. She still preferred fence lines, barn shadows, and the honest company of animals that never pretended not to stare. But on the morning of the workshop, June followed her to the truck and put her front paws on the running board like she had done before her sickness. Clara laughed and helped the dog into the cab. She carried her grandfather's notebook, her father's maps, and her own black field book into the same community hall, where people had once whispered that she was going to lose everything. Farmers filled the folding chairs. Mr. Harlan sat in the front row. Clara stood behind the table, opened the old notebook, and placed her hand flat on the page where her grandfather had written about guinea fowl half a century earlier. She showed them the maps, the numbers, the losses she had taken, the mistakes she had made, and the birds that had turned unwanted instinct into a living shield for the land. When she finished, the room stayed quiet. Not bored quiet. Listening quiet. Clara looked at the men who had laughed at her gate, the women who had whispered in town, the banker standing near the back wall with his hat in both hands, and the neighbors who had come with notebooks open on their knees. Then she said, "Land does not always need a louder farmer. Sometimes it just needs one who will listen long enough." No one moved for a moment. Then Mr. Harlan lowered his eyes to his notebook and wrote the sentence down. By summer, small flocks of guinea fowl began appearing on farms across the county. Not everywhere, not as a miracle, not as a replacement for every tool farmers had, but as one more old answer remembered at the right time, as one more way to listen before reaching for the quickest fix. Whitcomb Farm did not become rich overnight. The barn still needed work. The tractor still coughed smoke. Clara still had years of payments ahead of her, but the bank stopped calling every week. The pastures recovered. The cattle gained weight. The farm held. And in the evenings, when the heat settled low and the birds crossed the field like moving ash, Clara often stood at the gate where the road dust gathered on her boots. June sat beside her, no longer trembling, no longer chewing herself bloody, her ears lifted toward the sound of the pasture. Clara would rest one hand on the weathered post her father had set years before and look out over the land everyone had been so sure she could not save. The guinea fowl cried from the grass. The cows moved slowly toward water. The old farmhouse windows caught the last light. Clara had not saved the farm by arguing with the town. She had not saved it by pretending fear was not fear, or debt was not debt, or that stubbornness alone could grow grass. She had saved it by noticing what others stepped over, by trusting the records of people who had loved the land before her, and by doing the work long after the laughter should have broken her. Her father had left her a farm in trouble. Her grandfather had left her a forgotten note. June had reminded her what suffering looked like when it could not speak. And Clara Whitcomb left the county something bigger than a business. She left proof that sometimes the thing everyone calls useless is only waiting for someone patient enough to understand its purpose.